close to this time. So welcome to all of you who are staying on for the Grid Spotlight session. On behalf of ICSEI's Generational Renewal, Inclusion and Diversity, a Grid Standing Committee, I am thrilled to welcome you to our Spotlight session today, and it's called Leveraging Lessons from the Pandemic to Improve Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Ellen, maybe if you can add our slide deck up, that would be helpful here. Thank you. I've put in the chat, and please also consider adding your name to our Grid Padlet. We have here, we'd like you to take a moment to tell us who you are, where you are, and why you're participating today. And this will keep putting back into your into the chat section. And also we have the Learn Lab tool that we'll be using. So we have different technologies that we'll be playing with today. So I am one of your hosts this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where and when you're joining us, and thank you for being here. I'm Trista Holwick. I'm a project director for the ARC Education Project and a part-time professor at the University of Ottawa. And I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Ottawa in Ontario, Canada is on unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I acknowledge this in thanks to the Indigenous communities who have held relationship with this land for generations, and also in recognition of the historical and ongoing legacy of colonialism. Additionally, I acknowledge this as a point of reflection for us all as we work towards dismantling colonial practices. And if you would like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands you're on, please feel free. I'll also put into the chat a place you will be able to locate that should you be interested. So I'm hoping my partner is here, Maurizio Pino Jankovic, and maybe we can turn the slide, Ellen, to the next. Here, these are the places to reach GRID, Generational Renewal, Inclusion, Diversity Standing Committee. Please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter. And also, again, if you could put your name, location, and why you're here in the Padlet. So Maurizio, gonna reach out to see if you're here.
Yes, I'm right here, Trista.
Yeah, I can't see you. I'm like looking, I don't even know. I'm looking in all these different screens.
I was saying hi.
So
hi,
I'm going to pass
everyone.
it over to you.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. I'm very happy that we are here today. I'm Mauricio Pino Jankovic. I'm an associate researcher of the University of Chile here in Santiago, Chile, where I'm located. And I'm very happy that we are conducting this spotlight session about inclusion and equity from an international perspective, being this such an important topic always, but now that we are in very hard times, it's even more relevant to look at these issues. So the Grid Spotlight session is guided by 3 questions that will be addressed by our 3 guest presenters. We have here with us Troy Heffner from La Trobe University in Australia, Adil Ventahar at the University of Delaware in the United States, and Tasha Ausman at the Philemon Wright High School in Quebec, Canada, and the University of Ottawa. We will be using the Learn Lab collaboration tool that Trista was mentioning to help their presentation, to gather your comments and contributions. They are very relevant for us. We will try to engage with those. We will be reading them, so feel free to comment everything that you think that is relevant for these presentations that you are hearing. Also, remember to join to the Learn Lab net, where you will be able to put your information. And we are hoping that we will have a great presentation. We have 2 hosts here, me and Trista and me, but we will be now trying to take the time of the presenter. So the first question that we have for everyone is, what has been keeping you up at night in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion during the pandemic? The question that is right there. Now it's my pleasure to our first spotlight guest, Troy, who will be introducing himself and will be sharing his slide and start his presentation. So right to you, Troy, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. I will just start my timer because I know how precious time is. Hi, everyone. My name's Troy Heffner. I'm a lecturer at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. I my research is really about higher education, administration, and leadership. And I use this as a tool to think about ways we might be able to increase inclusive and diverse practices in the higher education sector. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm performing this work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Their land has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. When Trista and the committee first put these questions to us, one of the questions that really jumped out at me was, what has the pandemic amplified in relation to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I really liked this question because on one hand, it builds on the research I've already been doing, but it also really highlights an important point. As far as diversity and inclusion in higher education goes, in the last 3 to 5 years, we've seen some downward trends. And it's really important to realize that what has happened with the pandemic has really amplified this. And the reason I want to reiterate this so much is because time and time again, we see university leaders and managers and government talk about the negative things they've had to do with regards to higher education, and they use the pandemic as a starting point. So I'm thinking about things like reduction in staff numbers, reduction in funding, increasing course costs. We keep seeing people talk about these things as if they're happening because of the pandemic, but that's just not true. They were already happening. They just increased a lot more because of the pandemic, and that really exposed what was going on and has made people have to talk about them. I'd also like to just quickly touch on what marginalised groups really means in higher education research. It of course means things like gender, race, and sexual identity. But more than that, it's important to keep in mind that particularly in a higher education setting, marginalised doesn't mean minority. Marginalised means any group who's not in the circle of power. And in most universities, the circle of power remains the domain of able-bodied, heterosexual, privileged, middle-class white men. If we look on the flip side of that and to the majority, it doesn't really matter whether we're looking at students or academics or professional staff, those administrators that make universities work. In basically every university setting, and particularly in some faculties more than others, the majority of people are women. But of course, as most of you unfortunately know, that doesn't always transfer into promotion and leadership positions. That's still the domain of middle-class white men. So with those two factors out of the way, we could look at what has really happened with the pandemic and marginalised groups in universities. And I think what's really become clear is that the progress we have made has really been built on a house of cards of universities relying on billion-dollar endowments and ever-growing student numbers. It's almost like year after year, universities were able to put a little bit of money aside to make sure that their inclusive and diverse practices increased, and statistically, their staff and students grew. But now that we've seen some of that money be put away, it's really become obvious that systemic changes never really happened. I think for a lot of people that shouldn't be a surprise. Universities are 1,000 years old. The first 500 or 600 years was about religion. The next few hundred years was about extreme elite white privilege. It's only really been in the last few decades, and particularly the last 20 years, that we've actually seen universities make an effort to improve in this space. So if we think about a 1,000-year history, we probably shouldn't be surprised that what's happened in the last 20 years wasn't enough to make a systemic change. But in saying that, universities did make attempts. We saw scholarships increase, bursaries increase, pathway programs were put in place. Support services were put on campuses for staff and students. And that was fantastic. I don't want to take anything away from what universities had tried to do, because if they hadn't have done that, we would have been in a much worse situation than we are now. But for the last 3 to 5 years, researchers have known that that hasn't always worked. One thing that's become clear is you only need to go to a university website to know how important and how forward universities will be with their efforts in diversity and inclusion, and they'll talk about their statistics all day long. But the researchers point to the fact that, yes, you might have marginalized students in the classroom, but time and time again, we find that the best performing students tend to be white middle class students. When we talk about academics and professional staff, it's the same again. Marginal groups might be represented, but the people promoting the fastest, promoting to the highest positions, and certainly those people who are taking on presidential roles, vice chancellor roles, faculty deans, these people still tend to be not from marginalized groups, even if the marginalized groups are represented overall. The pandemic really put a new spin on this because the money left. The scholarships are gone, the support services are gone. The pathways, the bridging programs aren't there anymore. Essentially, we've watched marginalized groups in the last 12 months be put to the side, and universities have reverted to what they've always been, which is really just machines to continue growing middle-class privilege. I've got 30 seconds left, and I want to finish on a positive note. So I just want to point out that universities are having to rebuild, and some universities are having to rebuild from much lower situations than they were before. But we can look at this as an opportunity and make sure that as universities are rebuilding, that they're making sure that marginalized groups are at the forefront and central to making real systemic change as universities work out how they're going to move through the 21st centuries. And we can make sure that marginalized groups aren't really on the periphery in a superficial extra thought that it's turned out they have been up until now. Thank you very much.
Wow, Troy, that's a lot of information, powerful presentation in the time frame, and we do apologize for the constriction of the time. So many key points that hit me as I was listening to that presentation. The house of cards metaphor that you were using, and the idea that acknowledging progress has been made, but really now we're in this very tenuous situation. It'll be interesting to see what it starts to be promoted as we move forward. And I love the emphasis on, we need to have some action and move forward and think about this, because otherwise this house of cards is going to fall. I don't know, Maurizio, any thoughts around what key moments that stood out for you at this moment?
Yeah, I think that Troy is highlighting something that I think is relevant for any context, which is thinking about equity and inclusion as a favor, something that you provide, but when there is no money, we cannot do it anymore. So I think that there is a crucial aspect about how we will really think about these issues, not as something that we are giving to someone, but something that is a right to someone. So if we have this framework that the others that are minorities, we are doing something for them, and it's something that is actually their right, we will keep having these issues when we have pandemics or other kind of economical crisis. So I think that that's a very relevant issue that Troy pointed out.
Yeah, the idea of focusing on systemic change, not just tenuous change. Momentarily. Thanks so much, Troy. I know that there'll probably be many questions for you. Our plan is to work our way through each of our presenters and share all of the insights, and then have a little bit of time after for a more informal discussion. For those of you who missed some of Troy's presentation, we have recorded it, so it will be available as well. And that'll be 7 minutes I'll need to rewatch a number of times. So thanks so much, Troy. And maybe, Ellen, you could put up the second Learn Lab code, and we're providing some opportunities for you as participants to contribute as well. And so we have this first question, and we'll return to them after. We'll keep them open. So we're really looking at, what is keeping you up at night? And we also want to be thinking about what pandemic innovations have been introduced in your system that we should be holding on to moving forward. So building on some of the successes, some of the really benefits and opportunities that maybe have come from this session. So I am going to pass over the next speaking spotlight to our presenter, Adil Benthar, and he is presenting and will introduce himself, and his slides will be coming up as well. So Adil, just a note, Adil is a member of the GRID Standing Committee, so we're lucky enough to connect with him many, many times and learn from him.
Thank you, Trista. I'm so happy to be here today, and it really makes my day to see these smiling faces and at the Congress on a cold day here in Delaware. So my name is Adil Benthar, an assistant professor of English as a second language at the University of Delaware's English Language Institute. I will be referring to the English Language Institute as ELI. And as you can tell, I have an accent. I was born in Casablanca, Morocco, before coming to the US for graduate school in curriculum and instruction with a focus on in ESL. So I have been an international student myself, and this is a key detail I'd like to go back later. So before I delve into the topic of listing some innovations and measures that the ELI has taken to serve and improve our international students' accessibility to remote learning, let me just tell you a little bit about IEPs, Intensive English Programs. So IEPs serve adult international students, and they help them improve their language skills and prepare them culturally. And not only that, but also they help them matriculate as regular university students, both at the undergraduate and the graduate levels. IEPs are sometimes marginalized, if not often marginalized, academic units, and they're usually, if not always, self-funded. International students bring a non-Western centric perspective to campuses, which is much, and they help expose domestic or American students, in this case, American students, they help expose these students to new perspectives, international perspectives. So if you look at this diversity and internationalization that IEPs promote in higher education contexts, these are now much needed expectations, and if not requirements, that many colleges and universities aspire to. Most IEPs here in the US are currently dominated by students from China and Saudi Arabia. And these two nationalities are important for what's coming next. Now, throughout my involvement as a faculty member and a course design team member at the Intensive English Program, I grew more aware of the need of promoting and easing international students' access to technology and remote learning. It may be taken for granted, but not all international students, these are students who just arrived in the US trying to cope with the culture and integrate into the system, and all of a sudden you're adding an additional burden of them coping and dealing with technology. So while their language can be very limited. So it's not a problem of content, but also of technology expectations. Now, I will be talking about these measures in 3 levels: students, teachers, and technology. And you will see that they often overlap. So at the level of the students, a year ago, and amid much uncertainty about precautions and travel restrictions, we needed to reassure the students and their families, and also we needed to ensure their wellness. This was a top priority. When the pandemic hit, we had our students in country here, and like everyone, there was so much news, misinformation also around. So our students were lost. We created several town halls to reassure the students and their families. These are 17 and 18-year-old students and their families. We want to reassure them that they were safe. We had also to explain the policies followed by the university, the state, and the federal government to make sure they were safe, but also to ensure their access to remote learning, which seemed to be a new experience for many of our students. Moving forward, as more instruction began to be online, we had to deal with or consider Zoom fatigue. Remember, we're talking about international students. These are speakers of other languages, which means that once they are here in the US, they're already exhausted. They're tired. Why? Because if you are a native speaker, you think and act in one language. These are students who are already translating and processing so much content in both languages. first and the second or the foreign language, depending on what the language is. So we also we started to integrate asynchronous instruction in small doses to give them a little break. We trained them in how to use technology and prepared them to deal with connectivity issues, especially students who were in China, for example, or in Saudi Arabia, and other students overseas. We wanted to make sure that all students were ready to deal with these connectivity issues, knowing that, for example, the Chinese government sometimes blocks and monitors the students' online activity, which was a hurdle for us. So these students needed to be prepared. Also, one important innovation that we can confidently use in the future is a troubleshooting document that we created, and it is also available to the students in 5 languages. So we're not testing the students in English, we just want to give them what they need to know, what they need. In addition to offering flexible course schedules, our colleagues developed cultural online courses. And so just imagine, these are courses usually offered at 3 p.m. But 3 p.m. in the US is 3 a.m. in China and 11 p.m. in the Middle East. So we had to be flexible. At the level of the teachers, all the teachers had training in technology, and we digitalized the course materials and redesigned the existing courses. So we also offered a required orientation module. So all students and teachers had to have an orientation module to make sure the students are all on the same page in terms of their access to technology. Another aspect of that Zoom fatigue is redefining what attendance means. And now I'm talking about teachers. So think about it. What does attendance look like in a pandemic? Students are taking classes online. Think about Muslim students. For example, female Muslim students felt exposed because they had to turn on their cameras, which for many Middle Easterns, males and females, is culturally inappropriate. In the same vein, Chinese students also felt exposed because by turning on their cameras, they might be monitored by the government. We ended up modifying attendance policies without sacrificing participation and engagement. At the level of assessment, we also we passed no-fail policy throughout December. We revised grading systems. We granted students more time to complete assessments, and we suspended finals until the end of 2020. Now, technology as teachers and course designers, we found ourselves evaluating the merits of technology tools. We had to answer many questions. How comfortable are our English learners or students using this technology? Is the new application that we are about to use accessible where they are, let's say China and Turkey? What does free app entail in terms of students' privacy and identity protection? How safe is their access to technology? How linguistically and culturally prepared are students to cope with download and understand the terms that these apps give? This fell on the teachers in terms of technology. Intrinsic, I want to end with this statement about technology in intensive English programs or in higher education in general. It doesn't matter whether or not a technology tool can do something. It matters whether or not students can make sense of what the tool is doing. Now, in addition to all these measures, and during these unusual times, there's an even greater need to accommodate international students' individual needs by imparting messages of trust, hope, and empathy. And I can develop some of these points in discussion. There's so much more to say, but I stop here. Thank you all, and your questions are welcome.
Thank you, Adil. That was great. I love how you ended that presentation with trust, hope, and empathy. I think that there is a very important issue that you deal when you are talking, which is thinking about inclusion from a global perspective. Something that you are describing in this pandemic context that is also, it seems to have some challenge with political national levels. So I think that your presentation also brings the question about how do we think inclusion globally and what that entails in different cultural contexts. So that's a very interesting topic. Trista, I don't know if you want to comment anything that you have heard from
Sure.
Adil before we move on.
I think it was a nice reframing of the things that perhaps as instructors we take for granted. I'm thinking about learning the tools myself and then the added layers of language and culture and components and the flexibility that you've really worked on. I want to highlight that Adil was one of the writers for our first ICSEI Dialogic, and I put that in the chat as well. Some of the great articles there, and I see Paul's just popped it in the chat as well. Maurizio, your video is there, and we're hoping maybe we can have Troy and Tasha contribute to our next issue to continue this discussion further. It does feel a bit like a whirlwind, but Adil, thank you so much for reminding us of the importance of the work we do doesn't matter unless it's meeting the students. So it's not the tools we use, it's how the students can access it and use it. So thank you so much for that, that presentation. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Tasha Osman. And Tasha, we have an opportunity to connect with you. And this is it's a joy because I get a chance to see your work on Twitter a lot and also in person. So I'm going to pass you over to Tasha, who will introduce herself.
Thank you so much for having me today. And so I'm really lucky to be speaking to you. And good morning in my case from Canada's capital city, Ottawa-Gatineau. And as Trista acknowledged, it sits on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And my part of this wonderful spotlight session, and thank you to Troy and Adil for such wonderful insights from higher education. And I'm going to speak actually a bit to secondary education. Is to talk about leveraging pandemic opportunities. So I love the positive spin on this question, and I want to break down this particular phrase because sometimes with educational language, we can like slip into a kind of business verbiage where leveraging opportunities might be seen as benefiting certain stakeholders or meeting governmental targets. As we all know, as educators or administrators or higher education professors here, a situation like the pandemic had no target. No amount of goal setting could prepare us for the indeterminate timeline of revised teaching and evaluation goals. And we weren't even sure what the outcome would be for the future of our country's health. And I'm sure for folks around the world, you can identify with that, much less its educational plan, which here in Canada is done province by province. So today I want to lend insight into this sort of notion of leveraging opportunities from my work with children. I'm lucky to work both as a professor of education at the University of Ottawa in the Bachelor of Education program and in the Graduate Studies program. But I also maintained my full-time teaching position, which I had before I started graduate studies and of course before being a professor. And I teach with the local school board. It's my 14th year in the science classroom with students ranging from grade 9 to 11 as we don't have grade 12. And I work at a middle to low socio SES school. In an urban school. And so often, like Troy was mentioning, you know, when you say, I love that marginalized doesn't mean minority, you know, what things go into that phrase, even the phrase marginalized youth, I find could be a little bit problematic, but we definitely have a mixed group of students coming from a variety of backgrounds. When the pandemic forced us to close our school on Friday, March 13th, we, like many educators around the globe, had to change our pedagogies, modes of engagement, priorities and thoughts about curriculum pacing and what really mattered for student learning. And the novelty of being home to teach students virtually soon turned to acceptance. And luckily for me, where I teach, the school is not semestered. So I'd already built this great dynamic with the students, and we were kind of a family from September to March. So we finished all of our courses at that time, and I think as many people did, over Zoom with no final examinations, to the great relief of many students who'd struggled over the year. And I think a lot of educators at our school and others were able to show their competency through projects designed by educators. And they were not merely regurgitating things for standardized testing. And I think this kind of shifted the paradigm for how teachers began to think about their own empowerment and about the possibilities for assessment evaluation, for instruction outside of those boundaries. So following the summer break and leading into September, and we run a September to June school year, so productive, if nervous, conversations began to emerge amongst educators. Our school involves students alternating between virtual classes one day at home and one day in the building, and they flip back and forth. And we still see students every day, and I see them, they're working right now without me, which is great. But what would be one of the questions that we had would be, what would be the best way to attend to student learning in this new paradigm? In other words, to leverage the opportunity of a full school year without government final examinations in order to ensure solid content delivery, authentic evaluation, and a space where student pedagogical and emotional needs were going to be met. So for the first time in many years, teacher autonomy and professional judgment rose to the surface of school life. Without government exams looming in the background, we've taken the time required to focus deeply on specific content areas, allowing formerly diversionary topics or questions that students might ask in the classroom to take center stage. In fact, what constitutes diversionary? Like, shall I talk about the Mars lander and how show that footage in my biology class? Why not, if students are coming into the door with a real sense of engagement about something that's not just a science topic, but born out of their own desires to learn and share. And in fact, right now, my grade 9 students are working with a video that one of them found. And it's unbelievable. And it's something they've dug up off the internet, sent to me late at night. And my biology students are having a democratic moment about what they'd like to learn next. So I'll find out after we all end this Zoom session together. In my space, as in those of my colleagues, new topics have emerged as students are able to democratically change the paradigm of the classroom space, precisely because it is a classroom structure that never existed before. So freed from the bells, forcing them to run from one specialist classroom to another, bubbled students have homeroom families, and therefore microcultures have emerged. And each group of students is different in their interests, motivations, and desires, and we're stepping into their space as educators as we move from room to room, rather than them being subjected to our classroom culture. This is a real paradigm shift. So what about the online component to all of this? Foremost, I think students are more adept at technology than many adults would give them credit for. And flipping to Teams, OneDrive documents, Zoom lessons on alternate days, this was a fairly easy switch for students who are like true digital natives. I've had students speak or engage in chat online that would never utter a word in the physical classroom and still don't. The equity piece regarding technology still remains. Even as students given LTE sticks and laptops from school boards and our school, from mass deployment, they might still have trouble connecting, and that's a real issue. But a couple of things are happening. One, students who can't connect for technological or personal reasons, they're not adrift, they're not lost, they're in the next day where I can provide physical copies of materials and check in with how those students are doing. Also, the role of student agency has come to the forefront of learning. So I kind of name this the 24/7 teacher hotline, because chat messages come in late at night on Teams. Students express regrets about an absence the next day or have questions about other courses unrelated to your own. For me, it's usually mathematics, or sharing cool YouTube videos asking me, is this real? Can we talk about it? As educators, we might take note of the fact that students are not passively engaged with our content for a specific time block, like a 50-minute time block, as we might have previously assumed. One of the things students are leveraging here is the opportunity to access educators at all hours, and in so doing, knocking the temporal frame of conventional schooling to the ground. Students care about what they're learning well beyond the boundaries of class periods or only within a set of assessment practices. So this shouldn't be a revelation, because we know that children are inherently creative. But I would contend that the pandemic learning has given students more freedom to step in and declare their needs differently, change the face of schooling, and show us that creativity is often stifled by the imposed historical boundaries of traditional teaching. Finally, in regards to assessment, we all know kids are resilient. So that language, that discourse around resilience, especially in regards to failing students as lacking resilience, has always struck me as a little bit backwards. The kids I teach summer school, for example, those students who repeat math, let's say every single summer to move to the next grade, are often the most resilient students. So I think in some ways we need, what the pandemic has offered us is a way to step back and think about language that we apply to students, like accountability or resilience, that is often laid at the feet of those students. Students now are better able to name their struggles, seek alternate assessments, and take much needed time to learn the material without the pressure of this narrow exam determining their self-worth and their identity in a lot of cases, especially in the subjects that I teach, like mathematics and like high sciences, although that's not an exclusive to those courses. The 24/7 teacher access via chat and other mediums is teaching us that students do feel accountable for their learning, but not often in the most conventional ways, like texting at midnight. So one of the opportunities that's emerged is for a new technological and social pedagogy. To work with how modes of engagement might alter between in-person and online environments. And that's something that students can carry forward into the future. And sort of last but not least, with many parents attending my virtual classes, like literally hovering in the background, I've had the pleasure of leveraging one final opportunity, which is to share the work that I do with a wider audience. Involuntarily, but it's there. So it's strange and it's interesting. And I've had some parents say, I really enjoyed your lesson on blood typing, or I've really enjoyed your genetics lesson, which can be a little bit disconcerting sometimes. But sometimes issues of equity are also at play, like screaming toddlers and a pet cockatoo, true story. But I've experienced a great deal of respect from parents actually about the role of teachers in society, because there's a kind of witnessing going on that they didn't previously have access to, and sort of a lot of presumptions about what teachers do or do not do, say or don't say, or prepare or fail to prepare in the classroom has been upended by parents at the beginning of this pandemic, particularly taking on the role of home educator, but now now taking on this role of sort of witness. And they also have become a little bit more engaged in terms of saying, okay, I see what's coming home, I see what you're doing online, and then I see what has to go back the next day with my student. So for me, there's many opportunities that the pandemic's afforded. Students are doing well despite the masks and the PPE and the strange times. But my question, and I love the question that was up here, by the way, before, like what pandemic innovations, have been introduced that we should hold on to. My question that I'd written down is, should we be fully returning to old paradigms, once this is all over, and whether this is going to be over. We don't have, it's the indeterminate timeline. And so what often when we think about leveraging, we're thinking about leveraging something against a set target or against a set goal, but not against an indeterminate temporal and epidemiological, space in the world. So I hope that little window into the teaching life here in Canada, or in Eastern Canada anyway, has given us some food for thought, and also to be thinking about what should we keep and what should we let go.
Thank you, Tasha. What an excellent presentation in so short time, but so much good information to share. I think that was I really like your presentation, everyone's presentation, but something that struck me from what you are discussing is that we are in a pandemic context, a very difficult context, and despite of that, we have such a great opportunity, because some of the policies that seems that doesn't quite work, like accountability, standardization, are not there. So I think that your presentation makes me think in how this policy that in a regular context doesn't allow us to do great things. So it seems that even now we are doing great things. So your final question, I think there is a crucial one, like what do we want to keep from what is happening, not only in the classroom level, so also in the policy level, that we say, we did that in a pandemic. I mean, in a pandemic, we were able to do all this stuff. And now that we don't have a pandemic, hopefully in the next few years, what great things we can do if we put the right policies. So I think that there is an issue in the policies of your presentation that is important to discuss and keep us in the mind. And also this point about having the open classroom, it seems that now teachers are, I see the teacher of my daughter 1 week when she's online, and I see everything that is going on there. Before you have like an idea of what's happening. So there is something there about what this implies also for teachers and families, and how do we connect with them, and what we are seeing, and how we talk about that, what is happening in the classroom. So that, I think that is a great point of discussion. So now, Trista, to you, and to have this final part of the conversation.
Sure. Well, thanks, Tasha. And it's always fantastic to have a teacher involved. This is the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement, supporting practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. So the fact that your students are off doing their own work while you're here, we're so grateful that you were able to join us. And for me, I'm still thinking about this, like blowing open the temporal frame of schooling. how can we continue to blow that right wide open and question some of the familiar practices and why we do it, and do we need to continue at this point? And the teacher autonomy and the professional judgment, how do we continue that? So, also understanding the Quebec context, are the exams, this is a temporary pause on these assessments, but how do we start leveraging when we're thinking about the policies moving forward, and really advocating for some of these changes to not just be a temporary moment, but long term. And I'm really excited about your work helping to do that, and for contributing here to the conversation. So we, as you probably know, as visitors and participants here in this session, very tight timeline for these incredible presenters who have just shared so much information. Our official session ends in 4 minutes. We're going to stay on after for a more informal conversation. But what we would like to do, possibly ask Troy, Adil, or Tasha if there's a question you'd like to ask one of the other presenters in the next 4 minutes, and then we'll wrap up and continue the conversation. But is there anything that you're wrestling with or wondering about, or you'd like to dig a little deeper in? So over to you.
Also, 4 minutes is very small, so I wonder if, people want to blast a Twitter question at us at some point too.
Sure. Actually, can we put in? I'll put in everybody's Twitter handles into the chat while we do that. And Tasha, maybe you want to start us off with a question or a comment?
Well, I actually have worked with a lot of international students, and I was so struck by Adil's talking about things that we hadn't thought of in relation to Zoom fatigue for ESL students. And so when I work with students in my own school, it's a very bilingual province in terms of having French students and English students, but I also have a large number of students from French Middle East, from French Africa. And so when I think about how are those students interacting with the kinds of technological demands that secondary educators are placing on them, and then doing a one-to-one comparison with people whose mother tongue might be English, what is their experience of schooling from an equity standpoint? So this is a piece I'm going to carry sort of back with me to the building today and in the future for some PLC, professional learning communities discussions to say, as the kind of things that we're projecting on the screen, are those working for everybody? Are the kinds of demands that we have, are they, just like all students of any given age in batches, to quote Sir Ken Robinson, they're not all equal by age, but they're also not all equal by linguistic and other abilities that we may not have thought about in terms of engagement. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that perspective. It's not one that I thought about. I thought about download and upload and technology, because children sometimes are like, what does it mean to scan something on my phone? Those are very immediate, but the idea of engaging in a second language, it's very immediate.
If I may add, Tasha, with respect to admitting students, international students as regular students here. So sometimes, and this is something intensive English programs are trying to advocate for, in the sense that universities and colleges should not put the students' chances to cope with university studies using the same criteria as American students in this case. Because when you ask international students to take ACT and TOEFL and IELTS, you put in all those experiences in a one-shot test, standardized test, right? But with the students we spend with them at least 6 months, and you get to have to customize and better understand their needs and strengths. So the job that intensive English programs do does not include only administering tests, the tests that universities want, but also IEPs have a closer look into the strengths and the real potential of these international students who are using English as a third or sometimes fourth language.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you right there, Adil, because I know we can continue to talk. It's my time, 9:30. Sorry, everybody. It's 2:30 CT, and it's way evening for Troy, even though it looks really light where he is. But I'd like to thank our guests on behalf of the ICSEI Grid Standing Committee, on behalf of the hosts, myself and Maurizio, and all our colleagues who have been managing the chat. Thank you, Tasha, Tasha, Troy, Adil for your insights. We've recorded this session. We will be posting it for those people who are unable to attend. And please feel free to stay on for more casual conversation if we can. Hopefully Tasha's able to stick on even though our class is going. Troy, I don't know if Bed is calling, but come and join us for a little bit. And if you have to leave, we understand, but thank you for being with us today. Maurizio, any last words? No.
Thank you everyone. It's 10:30 here in my country. I know that we are done, and if everyone just wants to stay, please feel free to do. And thank you very much to the presenter. This was really excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Okay, so Adil, if you were speaking last. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Trista. Thank you so much.
Hey, Salman, nice to see you again.
See you in your morning time.
Yeah.
At our night time.
Perfect. See you then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Great to see so many of our grid members, Danette, Jacob, Vanessa, Michael. There's a question that came up. I'm not sure if Neil's still able to stay on, but there's a question in the chat. So how do we loosen up or release the shackles of control, standardization initiatives, pseudo indicators, fake tests, stopping us developing and innovating? So I have a question for those of you who are able to stay on.
That's my question.
Hell yeah, he's still here. There you are, Neil.
Yeah, that's my question, and it's really been a big part of my life.
Yeah, these standardized tests are real. And I just wanted to hopefully add, like, if it's okay if I can jump in, I bridge that gap between the Bachelor of Education programs and like being in the classroom with children. And I think there's often a real disconnect. Like there's very few people traversing both terrains, or like even as researchers, are they spending a great deal of time like with actual kids where they go beyond being the special guest, like the special event, the researcher entering this space, where children act very differently when there's a special guest. But if you spend long enough there, you're part of the family. And I think one of my things is, how do we change teacher education programs so that even if at the highest levels of ministry and policy and curriculum documentation, is there something we can do at the pedagogical level to kind of poke at the regime? And that's my job, is like sort of being you know, a rebel of middle management. So in the classroom is to say, like, how do I teach new BEd students to not do a quiz and a test and a lab and a quiz and a test and a lab for science courses, or just quizzes and tests and homework for mathematics courses, to basically usurp the traditional paradigm of the pedagogy and say, like, well, if you're collecting the same kind of data over and over and over again, i.e. testing, then you're only getting one kind of snapshot from the students. And if I can say, what about activity stations or dialogues or discussions or concept maps or whatever the story might be in terms of the way that I've shifted that, do these new teachers go into schools and start like poking at it from the inside? Because it has to be a mass effort before it's ever going to reach the ministry level. Maybe I'm wrong, or I don't have enough power in society, but at this, to like go to the top and say we need to change all of education's paradigms right now. But at the same time, like if we're going to do away with a fetishism about unit tests, which pervades things like mathematics and science, like you haven't really done it unless you've done the big test, you know. But what I'm finding out this year, which I kind of knew all along, is that like you really have done it without the big test, and that I don't, if I get some of that data once, I already know who can write a really great test and who can't, and I can let's move along and really like attend to it differently. So part of it's changing the paradigm from like looking at what can we do in teacher ed and what can we do at graduate studies, because a lot of administrators return to take a master's degree and more in graduate studies. And so like our voices as higher educators kind of need to be there so that it trickles down.
Maybe Troy, in higher ed, any further comments on that question?
I don't really have any further comments on that question, but I just need to say, I thought it was fascinating hearing about having the students and their parents in the background, because I teach master's level students who are usually senior teachers or assistant deputy principals. There's nothing unusual about having them sit there with 3 children run around them. And you usually can't make it through an hour class without a child asking a question. And that's just how it is now.
I love that idea of, you know, children engaged in graduate studies before, you know, like they've, you know, why not be engaged in these ideas? Are there any other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Can I pitch a rejoinder to that? Because I was a school principal for about 14 years in this system in Scotland. Now, looking back 12 and 14 years ago, we had such a pedagogically advanced system coming in, but it was ruined by audit. It's not just standardized tests I'm running at, it's standardized indicators imposed by auditors. Another point I want to make is that we had standardized assessments, which were not tests. I'm now looking at just how sophisticated, I've got it all written up actually. We had an audit system that trashed the curriculum system, and the curriculum agency was abolished in 2011. And we had, one thing I've come to view is criterion referencing and sorts of pulling together assessment evidence that then formed a portfolio that did actually evidence a summative outcome. I'm looking at our system as it was moving to seeing something that was so advanced. And in fact, I now feel I've got something else to do. There's so many of us presenting tomorrow, but I'm actually presenting a round table on this. And I've got a little paper on this, very short, and a podcast, which I'd love some of you to see because it's right on this. I think we are actually now, the Zoom world we're in a new space. So there's just a little opening pitch.
Well, Neil, put your podcast link in the chat, and that'll help people join us. Any other comments from Troy or Tasha or Adil or Maurizio and any of our participants?
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add to that question. I think that is a very relevant one, and because Chile is very good in standardized testing, we are one of the famous one in accountability. That's our thing, or bad thing for many years. So something that started changing that were the student movements who actually and their family were tired of the test. So mobilization started from more a political view, because they knew that that wasn't better. So I think that helps a lot to shift the system. And I think that in this context, something that might help us to shift the system is the evidence that we are discussing here, that it seems that when this accountability is not that present, we are seeing innovation and a lot of collaboration that seems to be supporting teachers to do things better. And in part, it's related with what researchers we do, what kind of data are we looking at. So the question is, what kind of data you are looking at that you want to make some claims to improve the system? So that might help. And also is, I think in this public arena, when everyone are seeing the teachers and we are valuing teachers from a different perspective, that also might help to shift the conversation. Like, are you seeing what teachers are actually doing? Do we really need to do all these tests if we are seeing what they are doing? Because there is something about the standard testing accountability that is related with distrust in teachers and not thinking that they can have their judgment about what teachers are learning, what the students are learning. So I think that there is an opening space for this conversation. Maybe we'll not shift the entire system, but we can talk in a different terms, I think.
Thanks so much, Mauricio, and the idea of trust, right, and professional judgment, and really putting that as primary. Adil, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to make a distinction here. So I was talking about international students, but those international students who are able to pursue their programs in the US are usually students coming from families that are relatively well-to-do, comfortable financially. So not every international student is able to pay tuition in the US. However, although our international students are part of the English learner category, right? There are other English learners who don't have the same support, who don't have the same favorable environment. And I'm thinking about immigrants and those newcomers and students with disabilities who are also struggling with the language in K through 12, not only in higher education, but also in middle schools and high schools. So if we know, for example, that 7 million, as of 2020, 7 million families in the US continue to lack internet access. So how could we reach out to those students whose families are already struggling in a pandemic? So our students are really, lucky because, and my program is already lucky because we have the financial means to make sure everything the teachers need is available to teachers to support the students. But what about those teachers who are working with English learners in districts that are already struck financially, and the teachers have so many great ideas, but they can't really make them, they can't materialize those ideas because the environment gets in the way. So I don't want to give a picture that all international students are lucky to have that support that helps them improve their accessibility of the technology, but there are many other English learners who may be also struggling because of the lack of those services. So we can't paint all English learners with a single brush. That's my point.
Well made, and an important distinction, and something that I think is resonating for all the presentations today. And are there any questions from our awesome participants who are still with us today?
Sure. Can I ask a question?
Sure,
Trish?
go ahead,
Yeah,
Mike. Yeah.
I want to say absolutely wonderful presentation from all of the presenters. I personally, I've been a teacher, principal, worked at every level. Now I'm at the university, and what I'm hearing from a lot of the students is the mental health, the loneliness, that every day it's the same old thing. What's your advice to them? I also found it interesting that in speaking with them, they're finding ways of coping, and sometimes it can be as simple as they're zooming from a different room just to change things. Or I mean, if you have a room that big, or if you do have a computer that, what's your take on these students?
I know for me, working with younger learners, I made sure I set up group chats or group environments for them so that their cohort could talk about, and I see a lot of this stuff in the background. So I've set up the chat. So I called it science chat, but science chat seems to be the everything chat. And so when you see students who are in a French class that's virtual saying, oh, I'm really nervous, I don't want to speak right now, I'm like, I'm going to hang up this call if she calls on me, that kind of stuff. And you see other students building up that student. You can do it. It's just like 3 sentences, you got this, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, if you build that infrastructure, and I understand you might be talking about higher ed, but I just wonder, like, what kind of communities, digital or otherwise, can students engage in where they're supporting each other through the mental health challenges and the technological and health challenges that go with learning? And what I'm learning from the children, because I may have set up the physical infrastructure, but they're the ones that curated those spaces to say, even just, I like, there were pop-ups while we were in presentation, like, what class do we have next? Oh my God, I lost my agenda. Don't worry. Or I can't sign up the attendance on Google Doc. It won't let me edit. I got you. Don't worry, my friend. I'll put your name in. So even if it's like little micro activities that are just getting the day going, then by the end of the day, it feels like a team accomplishment for my students. And I think in some ways, when they get off topic and talk about video games or things like that in those spaces, it's also our job as educators not to shut that down and say, like, this chat space is only pedagogical, stop talking about a video clip you watched or a video game you played, because I think if it transcends the whole school day where everyone's at home, it feels like more like the social space of the classroom, where kids do like look over and talk about Minecraft or whatever the game du jour might be. Yeah. So I kind of let it go. Yeah.
Oh, I love the idea of the infrastructure. Sorry to cut you off, Tasha.
No, go for it.
So the infrastructure piece, but that it has to be deliberate, but it also has to be owned by the people who it's made for. So there's that sort of tension there that it
yeah, and I stay out of it. Like, I stay out of it. There's usually very, like, nothing that's inappropriate that's going on there. And so even when it's on the edge, like, holy shit, I can't do this presentation, I'm like, I'm gonna let it slide. Like, you're expressing your real, like, emotions in that moment, and you are like 15, like, they're 15 to 17-year-old. So at the same time, like, but then you, like, it's followed up by, like, you can do it, so we're not gonna, like, rush in there. Like, if adults have this frenzy, right? Like, to rush in and correct everything all the time. I think, like, letting it brew or kind of marinate, and do its own thing it's great. It's great to watch.
Adil, do you have a comment on that?
Yes. So one of the issues, just to build on Michael's point, that loneliness becomes even worse when students move online. And given our population, we deal with Asian population, so Chinese students, for example. I'm not stereotyping, but it sometimes, I mean, many teachers, many IEP teachers would agree that with some nationalities, some nationalities would participate more and others would be reserved a little bit until you ask them to ask WH questions, follow-up questions with Asian students, for example. So with moving online, we noticed that, their morale went down because the support they had here, especially the students who had to go back home. And remember, we're talking about almost 80–90% of IEP students coming from China. Those students usually follow what their parents say. They may have plans here in the US and they know that the right thing to do is X and Y, but at the end of the day, it's what mommy and daddy says, those who are paying, that's what goes. So all the students had to go back to China. And with that, many of them felt lonely. So that opened new windows for us as a program to see what we can do to reach out to them. And in addition to building the academic foundations they need to start universities here regularly, we try to create activities like guitar club, cuisine, yoga activities, coffee hour. We even created a course called Gaming Sports, and the purpose of which was to help students enjoy what they want to do. They want to play games, but our goal is not just the game, it's also the language. So we created a course, a listening and speaking course, where the students meet other students. They are all synchronous, live, but they speak in English, and they also develop the culture that they need. These are international students who, once they arrive in the US, they will have to integrate and melt into the system. There shouldn't be any cultural discrepancies when it comes to how they are perceived by Americans. Americans will know a lot of things about games. So our goal is to also prepare these students culturally. And that's where the gaming piece comes, to feed two birds in one stone, the language, but also the cultural pieces needed here for them to integrate smoothly. So these are some of the cultural activities we designed, and we also encourage them to participate. Not always easy to foster participation among international students, especially when you're teaching online. So these are some of the challenges that also created opportunities for new ideas.
Thanks so much. Troy, any thoughts around these last comments?
I just wanted to say it's the loneliness that I have seen in Australian context for the most part. I think in December, something like 80% of international students who were in Australia were still in Australia because the borders closed so quickly, they were never able to leave. And the borders haven't internationally opened yet. So they haven't returned home for more than a year. A lot of these people are living in college, they're living on campus. It's the loneliness that has always been the problem. From an administrative level, I know that every university has just put every resource they have into making sure support services are available, but that can only go so much. But interesting from what other people have said, we realized probably in about the first week or maybe second week of being in our original lockdown a year ago now, that students were logging onto Zoom classes before the host arrived, and they were staying on after. And that was only to talk to each other. And so I think every university very quickly then realized, make the class a little longer, make sure there's breakout rooms, make sure those options, even if it's in class, a little hidden away, to make sure, go and have 20 minutes to talk about this topic that I know takes 5 minutes to talk about, so that you talk about what's on Netflix. I think we all know that's really not a solution, but from an educator's standpoint, that's kind of the best thing we can do right now.
Thanks so much. Again, these like setting up the systems to help support, but have it owned by others, and also keeping so the overview is not it's not part of it too. So we've set it up, but we're leaving the freedom. Yeah, thanks. I'm aware of the time. And so I know we have some people who need to get back to teaching. Some people need to get to bed who have been up really late and joining us. So thank you all for staying on and being part of this post discussion, more informal discussion. We're thrilled to have you here. Please look out for ICSEI Grid. We'll be calling for members to join us soon. And we're also really excited about the new dialogic process and issue. So check that out. Again, to Tasha, to Troy, to Adil, to the Grid standing committee members here, to my co-host Maurizio, and on behalf of ICSEI Grid, we thank you for being here today. Have a lovely rest of whatever the day is for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you
Thank you,
later.
Trista. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Ellen, for doing all of this fabulous work, recording and shifting. Can stop record.